An undersea expedition gone wrong. The Titan submersible that went missing last Sunday aimed to combine science with tourism. Similar private trips under the sea or into space have raised billions of dollars. The organizers say that helps fund science and industry. But are the risks too high? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Folly Thibault. Governments used to be the main funders of sea and space expeditions, but commercial companies offering adventures to the ends of the earth and beyond are attracting billions of dollars every year. Some of the dangers in commercial sea exploration have been exposed by the plight of the 5 men on board the Titan submersible that went missing. So are these multi-billion-dollar industries contributing to science? And how do such adventures benefit society? We'll put that to our guests in just a moment. But first, let's take a closer look at how private companies are pushing boundaries in space and under the sea. Commercial investments in the space race have tripled more than $110 billion in 2005 to nearly $357 billion in 2020. In May 2020, SpaceX became the first private company to send people to the International Space Station. In July 2021, Blue Origin sent its first commercial service into suborbital space. And this year, Virgin Galactic is about to send customers into space. In 2019, an American explorer broke a record by descending nearly 11 kilometers to the deepest place in the Pacific Ocean. What did he find? Sea creatures and a plastic bag and some sweet wrappers. And the company OceanGate has sought to further expand sea tourism, taking people deeper into the ocean than ever before. Now, away from commercial ventures, scientists are shining lights deep into space and the oceans. In July 2022, the James Webb captured its first images and from deeper into space than any telescope before. In June, scientists found phosphorus on one of Saturn's moons, an essential element needed for life. And looking down, scientists recently found more than 5,000 new species of marine life on a seabed between Hawaii and Mexico. But they're deeply concerned, too, as the area is earmarked for deep-sea mining. From transparent eels to stilt-legged spiderfish, scientists are continuing to discover strange life forms at greater depths. Well, let's bring in our guest now for today's Inside Story. In Kiel, Germany, Sylvia Sander, who's chair of the European Marine Board Working Group on Deep Sea and Ocean Health. In Bristol, Ezzy Pearson, an astrophysicist and space journalist. And in Kristiansand in Norway, Victor Lund Shammas, who's head of sociology and social work at the University of Agder. Thank you to all three of you for joining us on Inside Story today. Sylvia in Kiel, let me start with you. As we've said, in the past few years, commercial space tourism companies owned by billionaires Jeff Bezos, Richard Branson and Elon Musk have been making headlines for paying customers into space. How developed is commercial deep ocean exploration, and why do people go into these extreme expeditions?
Well, that's a good question. I think it's an adventure, right? People have done adventures since the humans are inhabiting the Earth. So I think that's one of the main reasons that people just aim for the adventure. I think I'm quite certain that this kind of tourism that has led now to this tragic loss of the Titan is not helping, learning more about the deep sea, for example. I think we also, from the Marine Board, from this working group I'm leading, we are looking into the impact of research even we are doing. And we are doing this in principle to learn and understand the ocean and the ecosystem, and not just to have a glimpse of some sea creatures down there. I mean, the deep ecosystem is very fragile and very slow. It's very cold and very deep. So everything is growing very, very slowly. and it can easily be disturbed. So noise is an issue, but also whirling up sediment and so on. So I mean, it's very sad for those people, definitely. Right. But I don't really see how this kind of adventure is helping research in general for the deep sea.
Sylvia, how developed is commercial deep ocean exploration when you compare it to space commercial exploration?
I do know that there are really some adventurers, I think, which are rich enough to fund their own vessels, like the person you've mentioned before, and that are, you know, sponsoring themselves to go down there with a little crew. And but then there are these real tourism organizations, like with the Titan now. I think that they're different things again. We can't just say commercial organizations going down into the deep sea. Right. I think it's you know, you have to differentiate. And of course, there are also organizations like the Smith Ocean organization that are non-governmental, that are really funding research, like true research. So I think it's like always, it's not black or white, and you have to differentiate.
Yeah.
Exactly, yeah.
Interesting. Ezzy, let me come to you, and we talk about space now because that's what you specialize in. In terms of scientific explorations, of course, we've come leap and bounds in the past 10 years. We've collected data from one of Saturn's moons. We've sent telescopes into deep space. How have private companies like SpaceX, Blue Origin, disrupted this traditional model of government-led space explorations? And what do you see as the benefits and drawbacks to them?
One of the big changes that's happened is that it's led to a lot more smaller missions happening. So, for instance, a couple of weeks ago, there was the Axiom 2 mission, which allowed the Saudi nation to put their first 2 astronauts into space on board a SpaceX rocket. And so it allows people who might not have been able to go into space before because they couldn't afford to do an entire space program and build their own rockets, but they can now pay for one to send their experiments and their astronauts into space. And we're seeing that that's going to happen a lot at the moon, specifically over the next couple of years. There's a whole bunch of private landers that are planning on being able to go to the moon and take experiments there. Partly that's to fuel NASA's Artemis mission, but also there's lots of people who, from everybody from universities to private individuals, are going to be able to use those. The problem that comes with that is this is a very new industry. There's not a lot of regulation that's going on at the moment, which means basically if you get the okay to launch your vehicle, you can pretty much, once you're in space, there's not a lot of people who can control and say what you do once you're up there. Yeah. So that's kind of one of the problems that's coming in from that.
Right. And it's interesting that you bring up the question of regulation, because that's a real issue when it comes to deep sea exploration. And I'll come back to you, Sylvia, in a moment. But I want to get your thoughts first, Victor. It seems that the question today isn't whether you can actually get there to space or the deep ocean. It's whether you can afford to get there. What are your thoughts about these commercial expeditions into space and the deep sea? How do you see them benefiting society?
Well, there's no doubt that space exploration in and of itself can be hugely beneficial to humanity, and certainly under the aegis of the state or private enterprise. We've seen technology, everything from LED bulbs to certain types of running shoes, CAT scans, wireless headsets, and so on, have all been said to have benefited in some way from the space race during the Cold War, and that might very well continue under the umbrella of these private entrepreneurs. And space exploration satisfies a kind of innate human desire to explore and to venture forth into the unknown. There seems to be a kind of common human impulse to explore and figure out what lies beyond the next bend, so to speak. But there are significant risks and costs, I would argue, associated with transferring power to these private enterprises in the domain of space exploration. So it's, in a way, hugely ironic that people like Elon Musk speak of turning us into a multi-planetary species, a form of risk mitigation against potentially catastrophic climate change, when the dozens and hundreds of rocket launches we see taking place now around the world threaten to accelerate climate change. And the United Nations Environment Program speaks of the creation of temporary ozone holes around launch sites. So there are potentially significant environmental harms from these constant rocket launches. And that's just one issue. There's also the political regulatory side of things, as the previous speaker mentioned. Who controls what goes on in outer space?
So risks and costs, especially when it comes to the environment. But what about, Victor, ethical concerns? What ethical concerns should be considered here?
Well, one of the benefits of what is called old space, meaning the kind of Cold War model where the state, the government, is in control of what goes on in terms of outer space, is that then you have a certain element of democratic control. So the question is really, who controls what goes on in outer space in the future? Will it be governments and, by extension, the people, the public, or will it be big private corporations and individual super wealthy billionaires, perhaps even trillionaires? We may come into a situation where the first trillionaire is a kind of space entrepreneur. So there is that issue, and there's also the issue, of course, of militarization of space, which is connected tangentially to this issue. Satellite technology is, of course, heavily involved in the building of a kind of globe-spanning military-industrial complex. There is a test ban treaty of 1963 that bans nuclear weapons testing in outer space, but we've seen the establishment of the U.S. Space Force as an element of militarization, not nuclearization necessarily, but militarization of outer space, and more will probably happen on that front in the years to come.
Yeah. Sylvia, what are your thoughts about this? Victor posed an important question there about who controls and who benefits from this. When it comes to deep sea exploration, this is an issue, especially in terms of the regulation. What kind of challenges are you seeing, and how do you address them, in your view?
I mean, I think in that sense, we're a little ahead of space in the marine realm, because we do have jurisdiction and legislation in place. We've got the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, UNCLOS, and we've also just yesterday actually signed the BBNJ, which is the Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction. So we do have legal instruments in place, and it's not kind of the Wild West down there. Of course, there is also, this is the area, the open ocean outside of the national jurisdiction. Of course, people can do what the national jurisdiction is allowing within the EEZ, so that's different too, and that counts for, you know, I guess, private operations, but also things like deep sea mining and so on. But I think people have realized that it's really necessary to set up organizations that are taking care of the ocean for human kindhood and for the benefit of the Earth. And probably it's the only time that before we as the humans destroy an ecosystem, that we are thinking about it, right? And try to at least put regulations in place. I guess how good they will work in the end, that will be seen, but there is an effort to do so.
Okay, interesting. Ezzy, you know, we talked about some of the significant achievements in space exploration and also commercial space exploration to some extent. But there are a lot of people asking today, why is the money being spent, you know, by companies, by these private companies and commercial companies? Why is this not being spent on, you know, man's exploration and given to governments, for example? Would that make a difference, you think?
Well, with a lot of the private-based companies, obviously they are businesses. They are trying to make money. It's people using money to make more money. So that's their sort of primary goal. They have larger goals of being able to perhaps go onto Mars and do things like that. But that is sort of their primary concern. But
what's the reward in terms of financial gain and scientific exploration?
So in terms of scientific exploration, it's really kind of, it's more with spaceflight, it's more of a tool, and it's giving access to people to be able to then go on and do what they want with it. So it is, these private spaceflight companies are still open to governments. In fact, that's one of the reasons why Blue Origin and SpaceX exist, is because NASA hired them to build these spacecraft to operate for them. And that's, in fact, one of NASA's big goals, is to support US companies in the space industry. So it's giving a different way to be able to conduct these scientific experiments that is out of the hands of just this one government agency, is the general idea. It is, obviously, it still costs a lot of money, but it is a lot cheaper to hire a company to send your spacecraft into space than it is to build a rocket to send it up there yourself.
Right. Victor, your thoughts about this, and looking at the future, how might technology and scientific advancements change our approach to space exploration and even deep sea exploration?
Well, I think it's important to bear in mind that there is a certain kind of false self-understanding amongst libertarian Silicon Valley billionaires, this kind of heroes of free enterprise. And I agree with the previous speaker that there is, in fact, a kind of imbrication with government funding and contracts, infrastructure. So this kind of Ayn Rand idea that many of these space entrepreneurs have about themselves is belied by their almost complete dependency and reliance on government funding. So it's important to not necessarily take the industry at their own, accept their own premises, as it were. And so a co-author, Thomas Holan, and myself, have developed this concept, which we call capitalist kind. It's the idea that certain private businessmen and entrepreneurs like to present themselves as if they are acting on behalf of humanity. But in reality, of course, they are acting on behalf of their own pocketbooks, so to speak, on behalf of the bottom line of their companies. And so that carries with it certain risks. In the outer space domain, we also have this Outer Space Treaty of 1967. It's a very progressive, in some sense, piece of legislation, an international treaty, which states that the exploration and use of outer space shall be carried out for the benefit and in the interest of all of mankind, all of humankind. So there is this kind of legal ideal from the Cold War era that the resources on offer out in outer space should be made available to all of humanity, but whether that will actually become reality or not seems somewhat dubious, given the way things are going politically and economically in this field.
Yeah. Sylvia, speaking about, the economics of all of it, I was curious to know whether these companies that are engaging in deep sea exploration today, are they properly accounting for the potential costs and the risks and potential cost of rescue missions, for example, with the example of the recent case? And, are they also accounting for the environmental damage that comes with it?
I doubt that they will do. I mean, this will cost a huge amount of money, this rescue activity. But I mean, that's always in the sea. If something gets lost, everybody is helping to find it, right? But of course, people are putting themselves at risk at their own choice. So I'm not entirely sure if they are insured for it to cover the cost or not. I in fact doubt it.
Yeah, Victor, do you know about this? I mean, do they take into account the risks and costs associated with, failing in a mission like this?
I think all that's priced into the contracts. I don't want to speak to the detailed day-to-day operations and kind of business affairs of these corporations, which are not, by and large, publicly listed corporations. So some of those details are probably not available to the public or to researchers. But I would reiterate the importance of maintaining the validity of the Outer Space Treaty of 1967, despite these developments.
Right. So then the question becomes, Sylvia, and I'm going to come to you, Ezzy, in a second, but I just wanted to get your thoughts, Sylvia, on how to balance the risk to the individuals, to the environment, and for the organizations leading these trips against the potential value for society as a whole. How do we balance it all?
I mean, to be fair, I don't see a benefit to the society in an activity as we see here, sadly, every news we are watching. I really don't see any benefit to it. It's really an adventure people are taking, and they're paying money for that, right? The research that is done in the deep sea, which is very expensive, is funded by national organizations like governments, right, to do research. They are still international, and they are open to all nations.
Right.
But they are not funded by these kind of organizations.
Okay, so tell us about some of the recent successes in which are not funded by these private companies. Tell us about some of the recent successes in deep sea exploration and what we've learned as a result.
Well, I mean, in the first place, we know very little about the deep sea, right? And every time sort of a head count or something like that is done, we find that over 50% of the species we are bringing up and we can specify are unknown so far. So there is a vast amount of organisms and species in the deep sea we have got no idea about. And every time an expedition is going down, they find new species. And in some cases, they find that they are actually in large numbers down there, right? That they're really having a big impact on the ecosystem down there. And we still, by now, haven't known about them. So more than 90% really of the deep sea is completely unknown because of its vastness, because of its depth, because it is very deep, really, and it's difficult to get down there.
Right.
But I mean, successes at the moment is really that we do find these organisms and that we have got the possibility of collecting samples in a very good way, mostly using remote operated vehicles because they are much cheaper than manned submersibles. And they do have exactly the same capability as manned submersibles. So there are very few manned submersibles actually in action for true research at the moment.
As you're assessing, the risks associated with these types of missions, whether in space or in the deep sea, how do you think nations, organizations, and/or companies prepare for the possibility of accidents or emergencies? And in other words, how do we balance the desire for exploration with the potential risks and dangers associated with it?
Well, certainly when it comes to national agencies, NASA's and the European Space Agencies are sort of the big example. There is a lot of concern put on safety. There's a lot of measures that have been put into place. And also looking back historically throughout the space age, there have been tragedies, people have died, and they've taken a lot of responsibility for that when it happened. There's always been a huge inquest. Human spaceflight would stop after Challenger. It stopped for about 2 years whilst they investigated exactly what was going on to make sure that those mistakes wouldn't happen again. So certainly there is a precedent of what to do in the space industry to make sure and minimize risks. Partly because when you want to protect human lives, and also, they don't want to lose their missions either. So it's safety is always a very big concern, whether that's human or a robotic mission even. Whether that will filter on to these private companies remains to be seen. It is worth saying that there is a lot, particularly in the US, there is a lot of regulations about what you can launch. So the FAA won't let you launch a spacecraft if they think it's dangerous. You need to be able to prove that it can support humans safely before they'll even let you launch it. So certainly in the US, there is a lot of safety checks that go on when it comes to space flight.
Okay. Victor, I'll ask you the same question. We've heard about the risks and the challenges, the risks to the environment, the risks to the individuals as well. What role do you think government and non-governmental organizations can play in better regulating all this?
Well, I think government can play a significant and expanded role in terms of particularly implementing an idea like a space tax, a particular tax on space resources, asteroid mining, for instance, but also satellite launches and satellite orbits. Asteroid mining is kind of a science fiction idea. It's still a ways in the future, but we need to start thinking about the political, economic, regulatory environment around those potentially significant resources out there. And one model for inspiration might be the case of Norway. So I'm based in Norway, Scandinavian society. which discovered significant oil resources in the 60s and 70s and taxed those resources very heavily indeed in order to fund a generous welfare state with things like free public health care and higher education and so on. And so it's really allowed the Norwegian government to fund its day-to-day activities. And in lieu of state ownership of space activities, there needs to be at least a minimum a kind of space tax in place to capture windfall profits and ensure that ordinary people, taxpayers, are remunerated in some fashion for those significant investments they've made in establishing what we might call the broad ecosystem that has allowed private enterprise to blossom around outer space activities today.
Very interesting. Ezzy, the benefits, what are your thoughts on this? How does everyone benefit from this? And what exciting developments are on the horizon that you think might have an impact on society?
Space industry is very much a part of our daily lives. GPS systems, I use one every day. It's how food gets around the world. Communications, all of these kinds of things. There is very big benefits that come from being able to get into space. There's also quite a lot of research that can be done with humans in spaceflight, and it might be much more long term, but getting out there and exploring the universe, I personally think would be a good thing. The question is when is those benefits going to show? I think in terms of things that we've got coming up, that's going to be really interesting. I mentioned earlier, people are going to be going back to the moon with NASA's Artemis mission. And there's going to be a lot more robotic missions that are going to go ahead of that are going to take a lot of smaller missions towards them. There's lots of small companies that are sending rovers and things to the surface of the moon. So I think it's going to be a big opportunity for some of the smaller industries out there to start benefiting from space exploration.
All right, Sylvia, you have the last word. What does the future look like for deep sea exploration?
What does it look like? Well, I think it's really robotics, autonomous instrumentations that use only little energy and can cover long distances. So, I mean, there is even kind of a no impact call for research, and I'm not sure if I'm for that, but there is thought, of sending out remote operated instrumentation to do the research for us. I guess it can be done in a lot of fields, where you map or where you can measure remotely, but not everything can be done remotely. So I think the research expeditions on board of a ship will remain, and I think they're very necessary to really discover more of the ocean and to see the connectivity of everything, because we haven't fully understood that. And I think it's very important to know the baseline we are at this very moment with our ocean before something like climate change kicks in and changes it, right? Yeah. And there is, I think really remote operated vehicles are the future for us to go.
Okay, thank you all very much for a very interesting conversation. I learned a lot, certainly. Thank you, Sylvia Sander, Ezzy Pearson, and Victor Lund Shammas. Thank you. And thank you, too, for watching. You can always watch this program again anytime by visiting our website at aljazeera.com. For further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. Of course, you can join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is at AJ Inside Story. From me, Folly, Thibault, and the whole team here in Doha, thanks for watching. Bye for now.